Hello and welcome to the Turkish History Podcast. Episode 54. King or Sultan?
Before we begin, if you have been enjoying this podcast, I'd like to ask you to please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get this podcast. It would mean a lot to me and would help more people find the podcast. Thank you for listening.
So last time, we discussed the ascendancy of Emir Ghazi, how he brought the Danishmends to the zenith of their power before being made a king by the Abbasid Caliph and the Great Sultan Sanjar far to the east, an honor that he did not live to see. But also how, under Danishmend vassalage, Mesud was secured on the throne in Konya as the Sultan of Rum. The decline of the Sultanate of Rum was arrested, and the other potential claimants to the throne were eliminated. We ended with the death of Emir Ghazi and the uncertain emissaries from Baghdad and Khorasan naming his son Muhammad as King of the North, with Mesud waiting in the wings, determined to not let his chance slip away. And today, we will chart the story of the succession to Emir Ghazi and the conflict and ultimately uneasy alliance between his son Muhammad and his son-in-law Mesud. And we will end with one man on top, the man who will reign as the longest-serving Sultan of Rum, and really bring the Sultanate of Rum into its maturity and establish it once again as the greatest Turkish state in Anatolia. Now to begin, remember that when Emir Ghazi died in 1134, Mesud was his son-in-law and vassal. Emir Ghazi, the Danishmend Bey, was the real lord of Anatolia. Mesud had joined his father-in-law in the campaign against Kastamonu in northern Anatolia, and he seems to have been there when his father-in-law and master died, and when the messengers from the Caliph in Baghdad and the Great Sultan far to the east arrived. When the messengers said that they had come to make Emir Ghazi a king, Mesud must have breathed a sigh of relief that the great man was dead. Had he been alive, the promotion of the powerful emir to king would have been a very worrying situation. But this relief was short-lived, because the messengers, disappointed to find Emir Ghazi dead and kind of unsure about what to do, then decided to bestow the title on Emir Ghazi's son, Muhammad. This was, of course, an unwelcome development, and Mesud seems to have departed with haste back to Konya. By being proclaimed as the King of the North, Muhammad now had a powerful advantage over any other Danishmend princes who might want to seize the throne. Indeed, the sources relate only one immediate challenger, a brother named Ayn al-Dawla, who briefly rebelled in the east before being brutally put down and forced to flee to the Crusaders. Separately, another brother seems to have been killed in Malatya as a precaution. But that was sort of it. Even the future Danishmend Bey Ya'abasan seems to have been biding his time. Thus, the usual struggle for power after the death of a Turkish bey didn't really happen. Interestingly, Muhammad seems to have left Sivas and set his capital up in the more centrally located city of Kayseri, once upon a time one of the greatest cities of Roman Anatolia. Kayseri lies on top of great trading routes and basically smack dab in the middle of Anatolia, the perfect place for the capital of the King of the North, the overlord of Turkish Anatolia. According to Bar Hebreus, then this Malik, Muhammad, restored Caesarea of Cappadocia, which had been destroyed for a long time, and there he dwelt. This is confirmed by Niketas Choniates, who also implies that in addition to setting up shop in Kayseri, Muhammad had maintained his father's overlordship of the Turkish bays to his east, saying, "The ruler of Kayseri was the aforementioned Muhammad, who was invested with great power, having subjected both a portion of Iberia and parts of Mesopotamia, and who traced his distant roots to the Arsacids, and was directly descended from the Danishmendids. These were brave and stout-hearted warriors, the strongest and most ruthless of those who had subdued the cities of the Romans." And I'd note that this sort of ridiculous attempt to tie the Danishmend house back to the Arsacids, the nomad rulers of Iran prior to the Sassanid dynasty, is quite interesting. Perhaps an attempt by the Byzantine writers to give the house of Danishmend a little bit more pomp and circumstance. Or maybe an echo in the sources of a Danishmend attempt to dress up their own dynasty a little bit as they rose. And it does seem that Muhammad was now in a pretty good position to build off the legacy of his father, to succeed him as the overlord of Turkish Anatolia. And without a huge fratricidal power struggle erupting after the death of Emir Ghazi, the Danishmend Beylik remained stable and secure, the top state in Turkish Anatolia. And this, of course, carried with it the corollary, that the vassalage of the Sultanate of Rum looked set to continue. This would, of course, be intolerable to Mesud. Yes, his father-in-law Emir Ghazi had put him on the throne and kept him on the throne. And yes, during the years of the powerful Bey's ascendancy, Mesud had been his loyal vassal, and indeed dependent on Emir Ghazi. Emir Ghazi had also very helpfully killed off any potential rivals to the Seljuk throne in Konya. But that did not mean that Mesud was going to meekly accept the second-place status for himself and for his sultanate. I mean, he was the Sultan of Rum, a prince of the house of Seljuk. And with Emir Ghazi gone, he felt that now was his chance to reclaim the Sultan's rightful place. Thus, predictably, Mesud fell into conflict with his brother-in-law Muhammad. Now, we don't know the exact details of the beginning of this struggle. Almost certainly, the two squabbled not just over the supremacy of title, king versus sultan, but tried to get the smaller beys of Anatolia onto their side. And it does seem that, in the beginning at least, Muhammad was getting the better of it. The position of the Danishmend Beylik, which again had avoided a horrible power struggle, was so commanding that Mesud was still locked into his subordinate status, desperately trying to claw his way out of it. However, things would not stay that way, as we'll see kind of by chance, and the Sultan of Rum would soon have some outside help in breaking the chains binding him to his Danishmend brother-in-law. See, the fall of Kastamonu had not gone unnoticed in Constantinople. Though the emperor had been forced to focus on the Balkans and his wars with the Pechenegs, the Serbs, the Hungarians, and even the Venetians, the fall of Kastamonu forced Emperor John to look back to the east. Kastamonu was a key city of northern Anatolia, lying just inland over the steep mountains from Sinop and the sea. And it was, once upon a time, the origin of the emperor's house, the Komnenoi. So after years of campaigning in the Balkans, in late 1134, the emperor assembled an army in Constantinople and marched east into Anatolia, determined to reconquer Kastamonu from the Danishmends. And thus, like it happened many times before, the Emperor of the Romans and the Roman Sultan got to talking, and soon they had entered into an alliance against Muhammad and the Danishmand Beylik. The chronicler John Kinamos tells us, Muhammad, Emir Ghazi's son, had been established in authority and was at variance with the chieftain of the city of Iconium, that is Konya, whom the Turks, honoring him above the rest, call Sultan. He, John, sent envoys to Iconium, and when he won him to his friendship, he persuaded him to fight alongside the Romans against Muhammad. This is confirmed by Niketas Choniates, who tells us, taking advantage of the opportunity to promote his own cause, the emperor made peace with Mesud. He entered into an alliance with him and marched against Muhammad. This alliance, of course, made perfect sense. On the Roman side, the emperor would now have the troops to regain Kastamonu and secure the empire's borders in northern Anatolia. And on the Sultanate side, Mesud would now be able to inflict a defeat on Muhammad that would damage his legitimacy and enforce the Sultanate's claim to rule Anatolia. And this alliance was initially quite successful. According to John Kinamos, aided by troops sent from Konya, the emperor was able to march on the immensely important fortress of Çankırı. This citadel was absolutely critical to controlling northern Anatolia, and it now looked set to fall to the alliance of the emperor and the sultan. But this naturally caused the king of the north, Muhammad, to freak out. Losing the critical fortress of Çankırı, especially so early in his reign, would be a grievous blow, and indeed might well be fatal. After all, his half-brothers were certainly watching to see how this would turn out. A loss to the Romans, especially so close to the Danishmand heartlands, would no doubt cause many of them to start pitching the bays of Anatolia on potential alternatives to the king of the north. Newly on the throne, and with the title of king having been intended for his father and not for himself, Muhammad just could not afford a loss here. And so King Muhammad reached out to Mesud and struck a deal. Unfortunately, we don't know the exact terms of this deal. Niketas Choniates tells us that Muhammad, realizing that he was unable to combat a double-edged attack by both armies, secretly contacted his fellow countryman Mesud and proposed in his letters, among other things, that they should set aside their enmity, contending that if they should not be reconciled, and Mesud defect to the emperor of the Romans, the cause of the Turks would be seriously damaged. He convinced the Iconian Mesud to break with the emperor, to join forces with him, and dissolve the alliance. Meanwhile, John Kinamos merely says that the two joined forces, and infers that their familial relationship was a part of it. They were, after all, brothers-in-law. Clearly, John Kinamos is not as intimately familiar with bloody fratricidal power struggles among Turkish brothers as we are. But whatever the exact terms of the deal, we know that it ended the vassalage of the Sultanate to the Danishmand Beylik. Their new relationship was to be an alliance. To be sure, an uneasy alliance, but not an arrangement of lord and vassal. Effectively, this deal marks the re-emergence of the sovereignty and independence of the Sultanate of Rum. Mesud was finally, for the first time in his 15-year career, truly the master of his own state, truly a sultan. And his rise is only just beginning. With this deal in hand, Mesud withdrew his forces from Çankırı in the dead of night. The Roman army was now exposed, deep in Turkish territory, without any reasonable chance of taking the citadel. Cursing the perfidy of the Turks, Emperor John was forced to withdraw his forces all the way back to Bursa, far to the west. There, the emperor regrouped over the winter, and when spring came, the imperial armies again advanced east. Led by Emperor John, the Byzantines marched on Kastamonu. There they engaged the forces of Muhammad, the king of the north. But according to Niketas Choniates and John Kinamos, Mesud and the forces of the Sultanate were not among them. That is, the deal between Mesud and Muhammad did not require Mesud to ride to Muhammad's aid, a sign of the new independence of the Sultan in Konya. The imperial armies then retook Kastamonu from Muhammad, apparently by coming to an agreement with the local Turkish bey. The armies then marched back to Çankırı, and both Niketas Choniates and John Kinamos implied that the imperial armies were unable to take the great fortress, but that the emperor nonetheless obtained its submission. Choniates even says that Emperor John entered the city in triumph. However, this would prove to be short-lived. Though our Roman historians don't dwell on it for obvious reasons, the fortress was soon retaken by Muhammad as the imperial armies marched back west. Indeed, the emperor's gaze was again being pulled from central Anatolia, this time further to the east and to the south, to Cilicia. As we discussed last time, after the First Crusade and the struggle between Bohemund and Emperor Alexios, an Armenian principality had emerged in Cilicia, and the relations between these Armenian princes and the Byzantine Empire were of course quite complex. Armenian lords had long served in the Roman armies, and the rulers of this new principality were descended from Armenian Roman generals who had decamped to the region following the catastrophe of Manzikert. Constantinople, of course, felt that these lands were a crucial part of the empire, both as a matter of history and tradition and from a strategic perspective. Cilicia bordered the Crusader states of Outremer to its east, and the territories of the Sultanate of Rum lay just over the mountains to the north. But Cilicia was also far from Constantinople, and as a practical matter, it was always hard to enforce the writ of the emperor here. And furthermore, the Armenian lords of the young principality in Cilicia of course valued their independence and their autonomy. They skillfully exploited the tensions between Constantinople and the Norman Crusaders in Antioch and Edessa to establish their own authority. And Armenian Cilicia, now a principality, was well on its way to becoming a kingdom in its own right. This really came to a head in the 1130s, as the powerful Armenian prince Levon I came to power. Levon consolidated his family's rule over Cilicia, and skillfully negotiating with the Turks, the Crusaders, and the Byzantine authorities expanded his power further. By the mid-1130s, he was basically the uncontested lord of Cilicia. The Armenian poet Vahram of Edessa writes of Levon that he invited many famous warriors to join him and allured them by great rewards. Forward in battle, he prepared himself and often fought against the foreigners or infidels, took their forts, and put all the inhabitants to the sword. He was the admiration of warriors and the fear of foreigners and infidels, so that they called him the new Ashtahag. All of this raised alarm bells in Constantinople, and Emperor John came to feel that Armenian Cilicia was more of a pressing concern than Turkish Anatolia. In addition, Emperor John was not enthused that his brother Isaac had taken refuge in Cilicia with the mighty Levon, even marrying Levon's daughter. See, John's brother, Isaac Komnenos, had been critical to his accession, but Isaac then became embittered against his brother and felt that in fact he deserved the purple. Fratricidal power struggles are, of course, almost as much a Byzantine tradition as a Turkish tradition. By 1130, he had defected to the Turks, taking refuge with Mesud, the Sultan of Rum, in Konya. Hosting an imperial prince would not have been a bother at all for Mesud. By hosting Isaac, he was not only getting a valuable bargaining chip in his relations with Constantinople, but perhaps more importantly, demonstrating to the Turks of Anatolia the importance and prestige of the Sultanate. This was especially important to Mesud as the Sultanate had been in the early 1130s a vassal of the mighty Danishmend Beylik. But after staying with the Sultan in Konya for a spell, Isaac then decamped on to nearby Cilicia, where Levon was really expanding the power of his new Armenian principality. As with Mesud, Levon was delighted to have this imperial exile in his court, and he promptly married his daughter to Isaac. All of this, understandably, raised the hackles of the emperor, who decided that he had to bring Armenian Cilicia into line. And thus, in 1136, the emperor assembled an army and a fleet and set sail for Cilicia. There the emperor would lead the imperial armies in campaigns against the Armenians, the Normans, and the great Muslim conqueror, the man who was currently paving the way for Saladin, Imad al-Din Zengi, the Atabey of Mosul. And with the imperial armies off in Cilicia, Muhammad and Mesud, now in a sort of uneasy alliance, began attacking Byzantine possessions across western Anatolia. In 1137, the forces of the Sultanate of Rum struck south across the mountains to disrupt the communication lines of the Byzantines campaigning in Cilicia, apparently in an alliance with the Armenian prince Levon. Following this, in 1138, a combined army led by Muhammad and Mesud personally, the king of the north and the Sultan of Rum, invaded western Anatolia. This was followed up by Muhammad raiding across northern Anatolia, reaching as far as Sakarya, a city extremely close to Izmit. And Izmit, remember, lies basically a day's ride from the Asian suburbs of Constantinople. These invasions marked the beginning of what was basically a 5-year war of attrition between the imperial armies and the Turks. Not every battle or campaign is recorded, and we should imagine basically constant low-grade warfare and raiding across the Byzantine-Turkish borderlands in western and northern Anatolia. But for his part, the king of the north not only raided west and north, but to the south, towards the lands of the Middle East, where the emperor himself was now campaigning. From Malatya, Turkish forces under the control of the Danishmends rode south, ravaging the land around Edessa. These forces were likely led by one of Muhammad's half-brothers, and Muhammad himself led campaigns into the Taurus Mountains bordering the Crusader principalities, but also the Armenian principality in Cilicia and the Sultanate of Rum. And meanwhile, King Muhammad continued to entrench his power in his northern Anatolian heartland. He began strengthening citadels and fortresses in the northern mountains that separated his kingdom from the Byzantine territories of Trabzon in Pontus, which were currently held by our old friend Constantine Gavras in defiance of the will of the emperor. In particular, the great fortress city of Niksar, which once imprisoned the Crusader Lord Bohemund, had been reinforced and refortified. And we do see some indications that the king of the north was forced to campaign in the east to maintain his position over the eastern bays, with somewhat mixed success. Gregory the priest, who continued Matthew of Edessa's chronicle, tells us that, at this time, Melik Mahmud, that is King Muhammad, went to the fortress of Shupsla and fought many battles and discharged countless arrows, but was unable to take the fortress. This fortress seems to be an unknown fortress of eastern Anatolia. Yet all in all, the Danishmend king of the north now stood in a pretty commanding position across Anatolia, and indeed was pressing on into what is now northern Syria. This strengthening of Muhammad prompted the Emperor John to lead a campaign against the Danishmends in northern Anatolia. In late 1138, feeling that the king of the north had to be opposed, and wanting to bring Trabzon back under imperial control, the emperor returned from the Levant to Constantinople and began rapidly assembling an army to head east. Thus, in spring 1139, Emperor John marched his army along the narrow coast of the Black Sea, crawling towards Trabzon, now ruled by Constantine Gavras. The arrival of the great imperial army overawed Constantine Gavras, and he decided that rather than oppose the emperor, he would submit. Thus, relatively bloodlessly, the far eastern region of Pontus was basically brought back under imperial control, effectively for the first time since the reign of Emperor Alexios Komnenos and the Byzantine reconquest of the area. But there were signs of trouble brewing. Firstly, the morale of the troops doesn't seem to have been that high. Choniates tells us that the army that marched east was extremely upset with the emperor, to say the least, saying, "What was particularly maddening, driving the troops to unspeakable hatred, was the fact that many who had gone up with him into Syria had not been allowed to look in on their domestic affairs, but suffering from sickness of body, inadequate provisions, and the loss of mounts on their long march, were compelled by those who kept diligent watch over the roads and points of embarkation to forego returning to their homelands, and to continue on to the imperial encampment." So the army was basically taken from Syria and Cilicia and then sent right on to campaign in Anatolia without being allowed to rest or see their families. Not very popular. The second sign of trouble was the timing. By the time the army was in Pontus and the submission of Gavras had been secured, it was autumn. This meant that any campaign into the interior of northern Anatolia would have to take place in the autumn and the winter. And as anyone who has been there can tell you, the mountains and the valleys of northeastern Anatolia in the winter are extremely cold and difficult terrain. Now perhaps the emperor could have waited for spring, but likely he was wary of keeping his unhappy troops from returning home for too long, and so felt that he just had to keep pushing forward. His aim was to take the critical fortress city of Niksar, where decades earlier Bohemund had been imprisoned. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, the king of the north, Muhammad, had of course heard of the march of this great imperial army, and he was now preparing to defend what was really the heartland of his kingdom. Aided by the conditions of northern Anatolia and the low morale of the Roman troops, Muhammad was able to make the Roman march over the mountains a freezing hell for the soldiers. Niketas Choniates tells us, "The land of the Cappadocians is frostbound, and the climate bitter cold, and as the winter that year was uncommon, he contended with diverse evils. Supplies were practically depleted, and all the pack animals and war chargers perished. Consequently, the foreign invaders were greatly heartened, and whereas they are infamous by reputation, leaving nothing unexplored and unexamined, and resort to frequent surprise attacks, engaging in plundering and raids, and sometimes fiercely joining in open combat, they always decimated the Roman phalanxes." Sort of the classic story of an imperial army marching into the mountains when facing bad conditions and Turkish mounted archers. John's army was severely depleted by the time the winter march through the mountains was over and was now in simply no shape to take Niksar. The Byzantine army nevertheless trudged over to the fortress where they attempted to put it to siege, but the Romans were hampered by constant Turkish attacks. Choniates tells us, Many were the battles fought between Turks and Romans around this city. In these skirmishes, it appears that the future emperor, Manuel Komnenos, the son of Emperor John, led a great and daring charge that is recorded by both Niketas Choniates and John Kinamos, though Choniates tells us that the emperor was in fact livid that his son had put himself in such extreme danger and ordered him flogged in secret after publicly celebrating his bravery. But not all of the Komnenoi performed so admirably. A certain John Komnenos, the nephew of the Emperor John, got into a spat with the emperor, and seeing as they are both named John, I'm going to call this John Nephew John. Nephew John had been ordered to surrender his mount to an Italian knight in the imperial armies. Remember that at this point, Byzantine armies were largely composed of Latin mercenaries from the west. Nephew John was of course incensed by this, and even challenged the Latin knight to a duel before grumpily assenting to his uncle. But he was not going to be taking this disrespect, and so, as Choniates tells us, then, after advancing a short distance, he turned his lance to the rear, placing it on his shoulder, and removing the helmet from his head, he defected to the Turks. And remember, defecting to the Turks was actually a bit of a family tradition for this branch of the Komnenoi, as Nephew John's father, Isaac, had himself defected to Mesud in Konya. Nephew John would soon end up riding to Konya, where he would take refuge with the Sultan of Rum, Mesud. In time, he would even convert to Islam and marry the Sultan's daughter. The first instance, as far as I can tell, of a member of a Roman imperial family converting to Islam. It would not be the last. With his army demoralized, his nephew with the Turks, and with no real chance of taking Niksar, Emperor John decided that he had no choice but to retreat. His army marched back north, through the Pontic Mountains and back to Trabzon. From there, they returned by sea to Constantinople. Muhammad, the king of the north, was of course elated by this. The imperial armies had been forced to retreat from his heartland in northern Anatolia, and the emperor's forces were clearly stretched and not entirely happy. And so Turkish raiding again intensified, now with Mesud and Muhammad allied against the Romans. By the late 1130s and early 1140s, the combined Danishmend and Seljuk armies were invading Sozopolis, near what is now Isparta in southwestern Turkey, just to the north of Antalya. Ibn al-Athir says that in 1141, in Rajab, that is February or March 1141, the son of Danishmend, lord of Malatya and other places, overcame a force of Byzantines, killed them, and took what they had as booty. Even the passes into Antalya in the south were threatened by the armies led by Muhammad and Mesud. This, of course, prompted the emperor to take the fight to the south to defend the empire's possessions and safeguard the route to Cilicia and the Middle East along the southern coast of Anatolia. The key target of the emperor on this campaign was Beyşehir Gölü, one of the key mountain lakes in the absolutely stunning mountains to the north of Antalya. John Kinamos tells us that the men of the mountains considered the lake a moat, and that upon crossing it, one could ride to Konya in a single day. This made it of critical importance to the emperor, as the mountain lake was basically a moat protecting the Sultanate's capital from the Roman city of Antalya. However, this campaign to seize the area around the lake was not successful. Tellingly, John Kinamos records that the local Greek inhabitants were not enthused about the emperor's plan, saying of them, "For by long time and usage they were united in their views with the Turks." In other words, the local Greek Christians were, by now, firmly allied with the Turks, and preferred Turkish rule to the rule of Constantinople. This is confirmed in even more explicit terms by Niketas Choniates, who writes, "These islands were inhabited by colonies of Christians who crossed Iconian in their barks and light boats, and by mingling with the Turks, not only strengthened their mutual bonds of friendship, but also maintained strong commercial ties. Allied with their neighbors, they looked upon the Romans as their enemies." This is an indication of a crucially important and ongoing process that we will discuss in more detail in a later non-narrative episode: Turkification. And as Niketas Koniatis implies, it was driven by the deep commercial, social, familial, and political ties growing and intensifying between the local Christians and their Turkish neighbors. In short, the native Anatolians were on their way to becoming Turks themselves. Unable to get the local Christians to go along with his plans, the emperor came up with an alternative. He attempted to launch a naval expedition on the lake with small skiffs, but a swift and dry wind then arose and sank his small fleet. Kinemo says that nonetheless the emperor was able to take several of the fortresses on the lake, but it seems that this was short-lived. The emperor was forced to march back down the mountains to Antalya, and the local Greeks promptly retook the fortresses and returned them to their Turkish allies. And I think that this episode, more than anything, illustrates the fundamental reason why Turkish rule would prove to be more permanent than the emperors and generals and historians in Constantinople ever really appreciated. In many parts of Anatolia, there was just no appetite among the locals for getting rid of the Turks. Indeed, many of the locals were on their way to becoming Turks themselves, and thus the Turks really were here to stay. But for now, it would seem that King Muhammad was really in a formidable position. Though the Sultan in Konya was no longer his vassal, the Danishmend king was still the leading Turkish potentate in Anatolia. And Mesud was now, if not a vassal, then still an ally, if a somewhat uneasy and untrustworthy ally. Muhammad was the king of the north, and the Danishmend Beylik seemed destined to continue its upward march, potentially even to rise above the Sultan in Konya. But it was not to be, because for unknown reasons, Muhammad died suddenly, likely in 1141 or early 1142. And though he hasn't been with us for that long, I think it's important to say that, like with his father, Muhammad represents a great what-if. He really could have continued to expand the power of the Danishmend Beylik, the Danishmend kingdom really, and make it the permanent Turkish power in Anatolia. But fate simply had other plans. Instead, Muhammad was really the first and the last Danishmend king of the north. And his death, of course, kicked off a classic fratricidal Turkish power struggle. Muhammad's son, Melik Zunun, claimed the throne, but this was immediately contested, and in Sivas, the half-brother of the late king, Ya'ab Hasan, quickly married Muhammad's widow and claimed the throne. Meanwhile, two other Danishmend princes, Ayn al-Dawla and Yunus, revolted in southeastern Anatolia. The Danishmend Beylik immediately fell into civil war and basically collapsed. A collapse, it turns out, that it would never recover from. In Konya, Mesud was elated to hear the news of the death of the king, because now, with King Muhammad gone, he spied his chance. Not only were the days of vassalage over, but so too now were even the days of alliance, of uneasy cooperation with the Danishmend Bey, and from here on, Mesud will march the Sultanate of Rum down the road to its ultimate destiny, to become, once again, and this time permanently, the supreme state of Turkish Anatolia. Indeed, it was at this point, this very moment, the death of Muhammad, that we can say Mesud assumed the position of the top Turkish potentate in Anatolia. Under Danishmend vassalage, the Sultanate had survived and stabilized, and, during Muhammad's reign, even regained its independence. But with the death of the king of the north and the collapse of the Danishmand Beylik, Mesud's time had finally come. He was now the greatest Turkish lord in all of Anatolia. And next time, we will chart the course of Mesud's rise as the Sultan once again becomes the overlord of Turkish Anatolia. And also as new invaders again set sail from the west.